So right now at our department, we have about 100 cameras that are deployed throughout our different divisions. We have all of patrol, our traffic officers, both those who drive the vehicles and those who are on motorcycles, our school resource officers, K-9 officers, and also the patrol sergeants. So the patrol lieutenants, transit officers, or the transit sergeants such as Casey and myself are not equipped with cameras at the moment, but quite a few of our officers are that are out interacting with the public. So some of the goals of our body-worn camera program that we had in mind when creating this is that, to have cameras on us does a lot of things for us. And one of the things is it allows us to capture our viewpoint as an officer of what's happening. As we go through our day and we interact with citizens, there's a lot of times when we're not recording video, but there are a lot of times that we are. And a lot of those relate to traffic stops or criminal investigations. And all those videos can be used later in the court process to document what we've seen. So it's one thing for an officer to go into court and testify about what they saw or what they heard or what someone told them, but to have an actual video of that presented in court is very valuable. It's also very helpful when it comes to our domestic violence investigations. And so when you're arriving on scene as a domestic violence situation and you're seeing, the victim and the suspect and their interactions and the scene of what's happening and the emotions that are happening and some injuries and all those things that are going on that are very dynamic and hard to capture in a report no matter how good of a writer you are, the video really does a great job of capturing that. So it'll really help us when it comes to those cases.
Okay. One of the other goals is to reduce the number of officer complaints and potential claims of liability. It's very easy when someone calls to say the officer was rude to me or I didn't have a good experience. We can instantly pull up the video and watch it, and we can have a discussion with them. So that's made that process much quicker and pretty clear what happened. To reduce use of force incidents, force responses, to increase transparency. We have the videos, they can be played in court. You can call if you've made a complaint, you can make an appointment to come see us and watch the video if it's not an ongoing criminal case, and we can see exactly what happened. And then to establish a technologically current and financially sustainable program. This program, it does cost money, it's not free, so we're constantly working to make ourselves more efficient and find the most financially sustainable ways to run the program. And we're still working on that process.
There we go. So as we look at the timeline of the things that happened to set this program into motion, really began quite a while ago, back in August of 2015 through March of 2016. Once we decided we were going to have a body-worn camera program and explore that option, one of the things to figure out is what kind of cameras do we want to use? What are the options for that? And there were a few different cameras we had tested out. There was a grant application that was finalized back in April of 2016. The grant was awarded and it was approved by City Council. And then from July of 2016 and for the year ahead, a lot of work going through that on developing the policy and working with the DA's office to make sure that our program was legally sufficient and meeting all the needs of all the different partners involved. And from March of 2017 through August of that year, we also worked with the community. There were a lot of different community meetings, forums, there's a survey that went out to make sure the community had input on what the program would look like as well. And then in April of 2017, we sent out requests for the different vendors to respond of what options they had for us as a product. And of the 11 responses we had, we chose 2 different vendors to look at their cameras and test those out in the field. And that testing in the field happened from July through September of 2017. Of the vendors we looked at, we chose Axon, and we'll show you the equipment that we have. Axon is pretty common these days for a lot of departments are using Axon body cameras. I think Beaverton is using Axon body cameras. And if you've watched some of the popular shows that are happening right now on the evening TV, a lot of the police shows have Axon body cameras that you'll see the Axon branding up at the top. So they're pretty widely used. After negotiating the contract and the City Council approved the contract, we went through the process there and then finally received our equipment this last summer. and went through training and deploying our cameras to our officers across September through November of this past year. So as of about the middle of November, all of our cameras were fully deployed to all of the different units that would be using them.
So the equipment, the camera we chose is this guy right here. It's called the Axon Flex 2. So it consists of a battery pack that has all the buttons that control the camera. And then it has a small camera, which is mounted on the officer's uniform somewhere above their shoulders. Most officers, you'll see them mounted on their right shoulder. There's also options to mount it. The motor officers have them mounted on their helmets or on their shoulder. There's an eyeglass mount. There's a neck mount. There's several different versions that you can mount. But the goal of picking this camera is we thought that it would give us the view that's closest to what an officer would see with their eyes. The other camera option that Axon has, it looks exactly like this, but it has a small lens in the top of the camera and it's mounted on the front of your shirt. So it gives you a little bit lower view. And a lot of the videos in force response situations, you get a lot of views of the inside of people's arms. So that's one of the reasons we chose this camera. So it has 12 hours of battery life. We work a minimum of a 12-hour shift. So this battery should theoretically, unless you're working overtime, last the duration of your shift. It captures video at 30 frames per second. So those of you that aren't technological, what that means is this camera takes 30 still frame photos every second. And then it uses an algorithm to meld them together to make it look like it's a continuous video. So when you break it down and watch it, you can watch each one of those frames. So you can see 30 things that happened in that second. While that seems like a lot, in the general scheme of things, it's really not. Like the human eye is at least 30 frames per second. If you're highly trained, like a professional athlete, they can get into over 100 frames per second is how fast they can perceive information. So while it seems 30 pictures in a second is a lot, it really isn't when you think of the capabilities of the human body. It has sort of a fisheye lens, so when you watch the videos, it'll have like a Ring doorbell, that kind of fisheye sense to it. It has a 120-degree field of view, slightly less than probably the human eye. It doesn't really have peripheral vision like we do. IP54 rated, that refers to the water-resistant qualities of the camera. That's been our major problem. They're not super water resistant. When we have a heavy downpour, the cameras have tended to fail. The camera itself, not the controller. It gets water in it and then it stops working. So we're working on getting some upgraded cameras. It records in 1280 by 720. It has the ability to record in 360, 720, or 1280. We chose middle of the road for storage reasons. The higher resolution you record in, the bigger storage you have to have for the videos. So we chose middle of the road, which is still very good. It's like our first generation flat screen TVs, those were 720. So that's still very good video. This little camera here, you guys will see, the hard drive in here can store 23 hours of video. So most officers are recording somewhere between an hour and a half to 4 hours of video per day in their 10-hour shift. If you take away downtime when they're not on calls or lunch or breaks. So a lot of our officers can store an entire week's worth of video on this tiny little hard drive. It's pretty amazing technology. We do try to download them every day. So we will get video up to the cloud every day. And then it has the ability, if you have multiple officers on scene, this is equipped with GPS, and once we tag it, you can play all the videos back together up to 4 at a time. So if you have 4 officers on scene, they're all involved in an incident, you can play their videos back together, synced, and you can see what they were each seeing at any particular moment. So it's kind of a neat feature of these cameras.
And as we go through the presentation, feel free to hold on to the cameras and pass them around, because as we cover different functions, you might feel like you want to play with that on the camera. That's fine to do. You're not going to hurt anything, and if you want to make recordings as we go and press those buttons, it's fine. We can eliminate those later, so don't worry about that.
Go ahead and make some videos.
So as she was saying, there's sort of 2 components to our system. There's the bigger box, which is the controller. That's the battery pack that powers the camera and lets you function the camera itself. So all the powering on, powering off, creating recordings, stopping recordings, seeing what status your camera is in, all those things are done through that bigger controller. And the other piece is the camera that she'd already talked about. So on the controller itself, there's a pretty simple set of buttons there. There's a slide lock on the top that slides back and forth to either power the controller and the camera on or power it off. There's a function button on the side, which we'll talk about in a bit what that does. There's a speaker on the front of it that emits some beeps at different times. And the big round circle on the front is actually a large button. So that's what's used to push to either start or stop the recording of capturing video. There's also a light that lights up around that button. That's a battery status light that shows the officer how much battery life their controller has left. And so looking at the top of the controller, there's a port where that cable that's already connected ports in there. There's a light that once you slide the camera or slide the controller to power on, the light will change colors. It will start up red as it goes through its system check and then turn to a flashing green. And then while there's audio and video being captured and recorded, it goes to a flashing red. And there's also a light in the middle that comes on when it first is powered on, that's blue. And then when the camera becomes muted, where the audio is not being captured, that light that's blue will then flash. So the camera itself also has lights and sound capabilities. This is also where it where it records the audio. So there's a microphone on that, and that's where the audio is that's coming in is being captured. But it will also make beeping noises and have lights at different times depending on what's happening with it.
So these cameras, they're always capturing video. So if you think of them like your home DVR, how you can back it up if you miss something, these do the same thing. So we have the ability to set that buffering mode to up to 2 minutes. We kind of went with 30 seconds because while it doesn't seem like a long time, it really is a long time. Other departments have chosen bigger, like LAPD, they buffer for 2 minutes. But what it does is it's constantly capturing video. So whatever you're looking at, so if you're looking at your phone, if you're driving around town, and then once we activate the camera, you'll get those previous 30 seconds without any audio. And then once we physically activate the camera, or we have a couple other ways that we can activate the cameras using tasers or our light bars in our cars, then you'll start getting audio. So especially in Muni-Corn, if you see there's no audio, that means likely that that was captured in this buffering mode.
Can you mute audio? Like, can the camera be the only thing?
Yes, officers have the ability to mute audio, so we can talk about that once we're done with the presentation. So once you get to the 30 seconds, it drops the first second off and captures that 30th second. So, and we'll show you guys a video of kind of what that looks like here in a second.
So it's always capturing and capturing and dumping video only whenever it's in that flashing green mode. So if you were to power on your controller now that you have with you, slide that switch over, starts with red and then goes to that flashing green, that's where officers are spending most of their time. And the intent of having that buffering mode is that in the event something were to happen suddenly and they forgot to start their recording until maybe moments after that event happened, you would still have at least the last 30 seconds of video only of what was being captured by the camera. You wouldn't lose that footage and it would be part of that same evidence file. So from that green buffering mode, to start recording and actually saving video and audio, what the officer would do in most cases is just double press that large round button that's on the front. So if you're in that flashing green mode and you double press that large round button, that'll activate the recording. So now the video file that you're creating will have the last 30 seconds that would happen prior to you pressing that button of video only, and then it'll have continuous audio and video recording until again the officer presses and holds that same button to deactivate the recording. While the camera's in recording mode, the light stays flashing red, and it also will beep and vibrate every 2 minutes to remind the officer that they're still recording video. So that way if they leave a situation and they're finished with that contact and they're just going about their business waiting for the next call or driving and looking for the next traffic stop, it'll remind them, hey, you're still recording video, you probably want to stop recording. So again, to deactivate, if you have that recorded now, it's just a long press and hold until the camera gives you some feedback. So you'll see the light will return to flashing green to that buffering mode. You'll hear a beep and you'll feel a vibration. So we have an example of a video that shows you what buffering mode looks like and shows you why it can be helpful. So this is a video that was captured in Baltimore, and you can see it's pretty shaky because the officer's running and they're in a foot pursuit with a suspect that you'll see here shortly. So all of this was captured during that buffering time, and in a bit you'll see the audio will pick up. That's the part where the officer actually activated the recording, and so we're getting not just the part where they recorded, but backwards these 30 seconds.
49-31, shots fired, shots fired. Don't move!
So here's the same thing slowed down, and you'll get a sense of a bit more of what the officer was perhaps perceiving as they were in pursuit of this suspect. And you'll see too that it says Axon Body 2 at the top. That's because that's a body camera as opposed to the shoulder-mounted Axon Flex that we have. And again, it's kind of a chest-mounted view as opposed to a shoulder-mounted view. So by having the buffering mode activated in this case, where you have those 30 seconds, which again doesn't sound like a lot, but you can see it was a pretty significant amount of video footage that was captured there, rather than going from the officer with a weapon pointed at a suspect who's on the ground and that's where the video starts, we actually have, this video was able to capture all those moments within the foot pursuit, including when the suspect turned and pointed a firearm at the officer, which then caused this encounter to end the way it did. So a bit ago, somebody asked about muting while recording audio. So the officers do have the ability to mute their audio recording. How they would do that, and if you'd like to try it if you have a camera with you, is while you're recording a video and the video indicator's flashing red at the top of the controller, if you press and hold that button that's on the side of the controller, eventually you'll see a flashing blue light that will start flashing on the top of the controller, and that means that the audio recording is muted. So at that point, the officer is capturing video only. This comes in handy in lots of ways. So one common example is if we have a brand new officer who's in the training phase with their trainer officer and they're needing to step away from the situation to talk about what they have or what they should do and go through some procedural steps. It's not really relevant to the interaction with whoever they're dealing with, but it's something that they're allowed to mute. Another thing that will commonly happen is somebody will come up and ask them questions about an unrelated incident, or maybe they'll have a phone call that will come in that they'll step away and take. So they're still on the scene of the incident, and this is particularly true for the patrol sergeants, or they'll maybe get another phone call that will come in about, hey, here's what I have on this other call, here's what I'm thinking, what do you think about that? And there's no reason to capture the audio of all that within the video of this particular incident. So this gives them that ability to mute that audio, and we do recommend that if they are muting their audio, that they just announce, yeah, I'm going to mute my audio to take a phone call, or I'm going to mute my audio to have a conversation with my coach. But it's not a requirement, just a suggestion. And then to take it out of mute, it would be the same thing to just press and hold that same button on the side until the blue light flashing goes away. You're back to regular recording, and then to then stop the recording again, you would just press and hold that large round button on the front of the controller.
So there's a couple other ways our cameras can be activated using signal devices. So every officer that issued a taser, it has a battery in it that emits a signal. So when I activate the taser, turn the power on to it, it will automatically activate any camera which is within about 10 feet. So I just heard hers activate. So that's when we're in those dynamic events and you don't have time to draw your taser, turn it on, and start your camera. This will automatically do it for you. The one caveat is if when I turn it off, it will not automatically turn your camera off. You have to manually turn that off. So press and hold that big round button. The other time that we can automatically activate a camera is in our cars. When we activate our light bars, we have 3 positions. 1 is our lights are off. 2, our lights are on, but not as many of them. And then 3 is our full light package is on. If we go 2 or 3 on our light bar, it will activate the camera, and any camera within about 10 feet. So that's also good when we get that really emergent call and we have to go fast. We flip our lights on. We're not trying to drive and turn our cameras on. The one thing we did learn is that it's not Hillsborough Axon camera specific. It will turn on any Axon camera within 10 feet. So our neighbors to the east, Beaverton, has Axon cameras, and we're frequently in the same areas as them. driving up and down 185th, which is our boundary. And if they were to be on the side of the road and we were to drive by them within the first 30 seconds that that signal is being emitted, it will also turn on their cameras. So I haven't heard of any events where that's happened, but it's absolutely possible. It's also absolutely possible when we're inside the station not going to a call and someone in the parking lot turns their light bar on, that they can theoretically activate our cameras. That has happened. So we have to be very aware of whether we're recording or not. So.
So along with the cameras, part of the equipment we had to issue to the officers to make these effective as a tool for them is an iPhone, is the product we chose, because the officers need a way to label their videos that are being recorded so that they match up and are findable later by case number or by incident number, and also to allow them to add a category to the video that tells the system how long to retain it as evidence. It'll also allow them to, prior to uploading their videos to storage, it'll allow them to watch their videos on that phone that are captured. So the phones don't actually ever have the video stored on them. They're just connecting through Wi-Fi and Bluetooth to the camera and allowing the officer to access the files that are stored on that camera prior to being uploaded. So if they've gone to a call and they want to watch a certain part of the video to get a quote just right or document something in their report in a certain way, they would have that ability to go pull up that video that's on their camera, watch it on their phone, and then once the video is uploaded, they can also access it later through the evidence system. And the other thing that that app will do as well is allow them to see what their camera is seeing. So as they are first getting familiar with their cameras and they want to make sure it's placed in a good spot and is viewing what they want it to view, they can use that live view to view what their camera is actually seeing to make sure that the angle and the placement is a good spot. So they're not just capturing their face or capturing the ground. It allows them to test that out.
The other app that we have on our phones as part of this project, it's called Axon Capture. It's where we now capture all of our still photos, audio recordings, and video recordings. This has by far been the biggest time saver for officers. It allows us to use our city-issued phone to create this digital evidence, and then we can automatically, once we put the case number on it, we can automatically ship it to the cloud from our phone in the field. This process used to take us anywhere from 15 to 30 minutes. We would have to take pictures with the digital camera, and then we would go back, we would use a card reader to put the pictures onto our computer, and then we'd upload them into our evidence system, and we had to enter all the information from the case. Now we just use this phone real quick, and it's been a huge time saver for us. So
as you know, if you have a personal experience with cameras in the past, it wasn't that long ago that most of us had like a point and shoot type camera that had an SD card in it with a couple AA batteries. And that was the same thing we'd issue to all of the officers, so that unless it was a really major crime scene and the evidence team was coming out to do more professional photos, that was what the officers had access to take photos. And so they weren't that great in quality. A lot of times the flash would, blur out whatever it was they were trying to capture, or they'd go to take a video or a picture and their battery are dead and the SD card is full, and it was a big problem. And so now, as many of you who have a smartphone have experienced, the ability of especially an iPhone that we are using to capture photos, it's a much higher quality of a photo that they're taking, especially in low light conditions at night with crashes. They're just taking much better photos, and they're taking much more photos because, again, they're not worried about exceeding that capacity of their SD card. So it's been a huge bonus for patrol. They've really enjoyed using this application.
And prior to this, patrol officers didn't have the ability to make audio or video recordings. We didn't have video cameras. We had a small video function on our point-and-shoot cameras, but because they ran on AA batteries, you could only record a short amount of video before the batteries went dead. And they weren't issued recorders. Only sergeants had recorders, so you would have to track down a sergeant, get their recorder, and then that took that recorder out of play until evidence was able to get the files off of it. So this gives us all now instant access to these functions, which we didn't have before. So
at the end of each officer's shift at both East and West Precinct, we have multiple docking stations that look like the one here on the slide. And each docking station can hold 6 controllers and 6 cameras. So these are all networked to a very high-speed internet connection, and at the end of the officer's shift, or if it's an officer with a take-home vehicle, at the end of their work week, they would dock their camera and their controller, which would let two things happen. One, it would charge the battery of the controller so it was ready to go again for their next shift, and two, it uploads all the videos to storage for retention for evidence purposes. So the nice thing about this system is while the officers can use their phones to view what's on their camera prior to uploading it, they're not able to edit or delete any of their videos or photos. So anything that they're capturing is stored and is maintains integrity and is uploaded through this system. And then again, when the officer comes in, by the time they've returned from their time off, the camera is empty and ready to go and make new videos, and the controller is charged and ready to power that camera for their next shift.
So just to give you an idea, it takes about 15 minutes for every 45 minutes of video we record. So for an officer that has 4 hours of video, they're looking at probably a little over an hour and a half to upload that video. So
the legislature did pass a House Bill 2571, which created a statute that governs how law enforcement agencies should use their body-worn camera program and what they should have as a sort of mandatory considerations as they create their policies and establish their program. So one of the requirements of that law is that we have to keep the recordings for at least 180 days or 6 months, but not more than 30 months for videos that are not related to an ongoing court proceeding or something that we would normally keep through the course of evidence. It also requires the officers to record in certain situations. And so if you're out having coffee and you come across an officer out in the community and they're just having a conversation with you, that typically is not something that the officer would record. So if they're just having casual conversations with community members like we do all the time, those aren't something that we're typically recording. But the times when they're required to record are the times when they develop a reason to stop someone. So if they have reasonable suspicion or probable cause to believe a crime or violation has occurred or is about to occur, then they're required to record that, and they're required to continue recording until they've stopped participating in whatever that situation is. Another thing in terms of privacy considerations, on top of not keeping these videos forever, is that these videos are not allowed to be used within a facial recognition technology to analyze the recording. So we can't just take a bunch of recordings of the public and then run that through facial recognition to try to identify people. It's actually prohibited as part of this statute. And also, we're not able to use these recordings for anything other than a legitimate law enforcement purpose. So again, these are all driven as privacy concerns of the community to make sure that we're not doing anything with our videos that are not related to legitimate law enforcement purposes, and we're not just keeping them forever and holding on to them.
So financial considerations, that's everyone's big question. How much did this cost? Back in 2016 in the fall, we received a grant for $217,500 to get us started with this program. It was a matching grant. We were one of 4 Oregon law enforcement agencies that received this grant at the time.
So we have some more numbers on that for you as far as what does our contract for Axon look like for our cloud-based storage and for our equipment. How much does it cost to supply an officer with all these tools that they would need to be part of this program? And then what are the costs for the docking stations that we talked about for charging the batteries of these controllers and then uploading the videos of these cameras. So there is a significant cost that is associated to this program that we're looking at as a long-term thing that we'll need to manage to sustain the program in the long term. So there's a lot of questions that have come up that we included here as a sort of frequently asked questions. One of the biggest questions is, does the officer have to tell me that they're recording me? And the answer is yes. Officers are required to announce to you, if they are recording you, that they're recording. The only time that there would be an exception to that is if there's something happening that's a very hazardous and fast-evolving situation where they don't have time to say, hey, I'm recording you in the midst of something that's very dynamic and fast-paced. Once there's a lull in that, then they're required to announce that the person is being recorded. So it's based on officer safety or the safety of others or impairing a criminal investigation in some way. But in most cases, yes, the officer does need to tell you that you're being recorded.
Well, the next big question from people is, do I have to be recorded? The answer to that one's yes and no. So the statute allows us to record people that don't want to be recorded. I think the intent of that was suspects. If suspect is adamant that they don't want to be recorded, the law still allows us to do that. And in certain cases, the law requires us to record suspects if they've committed certain crimes. But in general, we don't record vulnerable victims, so that would include the elderly, children, people with developmental disabilities, anything that's sensitive in nature or it's counterproductive to your investigation, so namely sexual assaults. We will not record those victims. And if someone who is not a suspect in the case is adamant and won't speak with you, our policy does allow us to turn the video off or mute the video to facilitate that person talking to us. So.
And so along with that, as far as interviews with victims or witnesses to things, those may or may not be recorded, again, depending on the situation and depending on whether or not the person has asked that they be recorded or not. It seems as though in the time I was wearing a camera as I was out as a patrol sergeant, most people at this point almost expect that they're being recorded by officers because there is such a high number of TV shows and other things showing these cameras out and about. People are getting accustomed to seeing them and aren't as uncomfortable with them as maybe we had expected. But each situation can be different, and it just depends on what's happening. So it's not a concrete answer on that.
It's kind of the same thing with the casual conversation. Generally, no, if we're walking down the street or we're at coffee and one of you comes up and asks us a question, we're not going to activate our camera and record you. It kind of just depends on the nature of the conversation. If it's casual but confrontational in nature, maybe yes. There's those people in the community that want to be confrontational. We may start our camera. We're not required to. In general, the purpose of these is for us to record us doing our official police business. So when we're stopping people on traffic stops or subject stops or investigating a crime, that's really the purpose of these cameras, and that's what we're generally recording.
So as far as when the cameras will be recording, the cameras, like we talked about, need to record in certain situations. We're required to begin recording in those situations. And again, some of those same situations would be like traffic stops, pursuits, vehicle searches, confrontations, and those use of force situations. The officers also have the ability to activate their recordings during their legitimate law enforcement contacts when they think it would be appropriate or valuable, and again, taking into account privacy considerations.
Who will have access to the videos recorded by officers? I think this is probably one of the most confusing aspects of the cameras right now. But in general, they are exempt from public records requests by statute. That's not to say that they won't be, but it will be weighed as a public interest type thing. Generally, if someone were calling to make a complaint and there was some dispute about what actually happened, I think we've all agreed that we would likely make an appointment with them to come in and watch the video with us so we could resolve the issue. But mostly these are just be used for law enforcement. So they're going to be used in court. They're going to be used for officers to refresh their recollection of what happened for report writing. But in general, we're just not sitting around watching the videos. Most officers record their videos, and unless they need them for a report, generally they just get automatically shipped up to the cloud, and they sit there until they're needed for a court proceeding, or an investigation.
So as we look at, why shouldn't we just broadcast everything we record out to maybe the internet, and so everybody could watch it all the time? Why can't we do that? And the biggest reason for that comes down to privacy considerations. And again, the idea that if these are related to an active or ongoing investigation, it wouldn't be appropriate to release them. So as people are going through and calling 911 for the help from the police, there's a lot of times, if you can think of maybe a personal experience you've had with that, where you would rather not have all of their personal business broadcast to the world at all times. So that, as much as we have these available so that when we do have those large-scale public interest events that the public would likely demand to see the video, in the less public interest situations where there's a lot of privacy considerations, we'll be likely erring on the side of that privacy.
This is a topic I'm passionate about. So what are the limitations of body-worn cameras? These days you hear, well, I don't need you to tell me what happened because it's on video. Well, a video is just one perspective of what happened. It's not the all-encompassing thing. So you have to remember, cameras can't capture what happened outside the field of view of cameras. So there's all kinds of things happening in the world that your camera's not going to see. How the camera is mounted, especially the angle and the location, it may not capture what the officer saw. So if I'm standing here talking to someone in the front row, I can absolutely see the commander over there, but my camera may not. It may see the side of my face and the person I'm talking to, but I can absolutely see what's on the other side of the room, and the camera's not going to see that. Cameras generally have much better night vision than a person, so it's going to see better at night than the officer probably could have. The officer's body, I mentioned it, may block the view of the camera. And then there are just some limitations to how digital video is captured, that it's not like the old days when it was light on a plate and it captured everything in the frame. What allows digital cameras to take such amazing photos is that it has a computer program within it that will filter out imperfections. Well, to us, that imperfection may have been very important to our decision making, and the camera may have seen that as a flaw in the photo and edited it out. So just remember that there are limitations, and it should be taken as a singular piece of evidence that should be challenged like any other piece of evidence. If the officer has a different recollection or a witness has a different recollection, it doesn't necessarily mean that what they're saying they saw didn't happen. It just means it wasn't captured by the camera. So I very much encourage people to keep that in mind when you see something on TV, that may not have been the perception of the people involved at the time. So the other limitation, like I talked about earlier, is that it only captures 30 frames per second. Most humans, and probably a highly trained police officers, most of us probably process much faster than that. And it also doesn't have the sixth sense, I call it the mama sense for the mamas in the room, that when you know something's wrong and you can sense it, well, the camera doesn't have that. And as officers, you can sense that danger is coming, and your camera can't do that. It just literally takes a picture of what it can see. So.
So if you have additional questions after today, there's some ways you can reach out for more information. The US DOJ has put out some resources on body-worn cameras as a toolkit. There's a website there for that, as well as contact information for our body cam program manager, Donnell O'Loughlin.